Hey, tonight we're going to do a special treat tonight on Monday night. We're going to continue on reading To Keep or Not to Keep, Why Christians Should Not Give Up Their Firearms or Their Guns by Chuck and Timothy Baldwin. These are both lawyers, but we're going to be reading pages. We start reading pages 96 to 107, top of 107. So if you have this book, To Keep or Not to Keep, Why Christians Should Not Give Up Their Guns by Timothy Baldwin, J.D. and Charles O. Chuck Baldwin, D. If you have that book, you can join with us and read with us. Now I'm going to give you some commentary along the way. So before we get started, let's pray. Dear Lord, thank you for everything that you do for us, to give us a job, the home, the children, the family, and that we love each other and that we care about each other. Help me, Lord, to get this message across tonight so people can learn and grow and appreciate the fact that they have their firearms for protection and not just for mere sport or recreation, but also for protection mainly and for ultimately our freedom in this society, and that we don't lose our freedom by our guns being taken away like they are in 4 states: New York, California, Chicago, I think Illinois is one. Ohio. So, 4 states have their guns banned. So let's read what this says. We're going to start on page 96 and go to 107, the top of it. Okay. This is what it says. It says, had Moses not been successful in his defense in Israel, his act would have been no less honorable. The Old Testament as well as the New Testament show that evil men have condemned and killed the just or the innocent. Okay, for what practical power do unwarned people have against unlimited and arbitrary governments? Through their force, all right, regardless of pragmatics. However, the inevitable and rightful result of unjust killing is that man will defend his or her right to live in peace with one another. It says, whether through rebellion, as in the case of Moses, war, as in the very case of Abraham, or redless, as in the case of Esther. It says, lest the people be ensnared, as Psalms puts it, 37 verses 14 and 15, King James, it shows us this retribution comes by the very sword. It says, like Abraham who rescued Lot from slavery, God also saw Moses as a leader to defend the defenseless and to establish a free nation for God's own people. But Moses would not have been this leader had he not went out to his own brethren and looked on their burdens. I mean, he took on their burdens. I mean, he sat with them and prayed with them. Churches, we need to get like that and pray more for our brothers and sisters' burdens. It says only judgment blind people, people who are ignorant, will ignore oppression, and they choose not to do anything about it. because they don't want to get involved because they think their promise and fate is sealed. If they do exactly what the government says, lick the butts and boots of these people that doing the tyranny, and a dictator, everything's going to be fine. But as we see in other countries around the world, that's not so. And it's not true. It's a lie from hell itself, from the devil. So that's where all this is really coming from. It's anarchy, dictatorship, and things of that sort. That's where they do come from. Anyway, let's move on. Moses was not alone in his defense of the Hebrew children, because God himself assured that all the Israelites left Egypt and they were armed with swords. Okay? Significantly, it was revealed to us that God's delivery of Israel began with Moses' use of the sword and ended with the people's oppression of swords, meaning it was taken away. The oppression was taken away because they killed the people that were doing it. It says even the majority of the New Testament writers will often praise of Moses and his appearance with Jesus, in his disciples' presence. But Moses exclaimed, righteousness necessarily includes his act in defending the oppressed people. Okay, let's look at self-defense rejectors. Their refusal to even fail to even recognize the universal application that God created in the law of self-defense, and foolishly attempts to turn Jesus against this very law that was established by him. Our Savior's words about giving to him that takes the turning of the cheek to is a lot smiter. It's found in Matthew 5 verses 39 through 42. It must be interpreted by the very principle of love that lies at the very foundation of this law. Giving to every tramp and yielding to every murmurer is not pleasing our neighbor, when we do that. For that reason, which is good, unto edifying is edifying. And that's found in Romans 15 verse 2. It says, only by confounding the divine law with Scripture, prohibition could one right. Sin is the transgression of a divine law, but there is no divine law against suicide. So therefore, suicide is not sin. Wrong. Okay, self-defense rejectors refuse to admit by destroying God's universal law of self-defense only harms our neighbors and violates the universal law of love, which is the greatest law of all law. So showing further the very significance of Jesus' usage of the Old Testament concept of teaching, let's consider how the book of Lamentations follows, turns the other cheek by asserting what Jesus, when he said that, coined that phrase, the rights of all man. It says, for the Lord does not afflict willingly or grieve the children of men to crush under his feet all the prisoners of this earth, to turn aside or put away the right of a man before the very face of the Most High, which is God, Jesus. To subvert a man in his cause, the Lord approves not, meaning he does not approve of this action. He's against this. God is against this. This cause of man is the same right that Abraham used to convince God not to kill the innocent with all the wicked or the guilty. It is also the very same right that Moses considered when he defended the Hebrew slave Lot. It is the same right. Hold a second, I'm going to turn the page here. The righteous use to defend the innocent. It is the same right, and the courts also use when imposing punishment upon the guilty parties. It is also the very same right that Christians should use to form free societies in the world and to remove oppression from their people. Says the book of Lamentations says this: anyone who claims God approves of oppressing the innocent or the just, denying the rights of others and crushing the very weak, distorts the very views of God. Therefore, Jesus does not repeal the law of self-preservation and the care we are to take of our families. We may avoid evil and may resist it so far as it's necessary to our own security, safety, and well-being. That a patient man may accept a slap on the cheek every now and then, or it may happen, but he will moreover consider defending the very rights of man. So that's something to remember. Let's look at what Jesus meant when he said eye for an eye. Okay? Now, looking at Jesus' statement, eye for an eye statement, this is where Jesus taught another Old Testament teaching or concept here. And he also highlighted it, the Pharisees, says misuse or misinterpretation of what it actually meant. Says the Old Testament did not teach what the Pharisees were teaching to the Jews and the bystanders. Rather, the law taught the following. Okay, let's look at this together. It says, if men strike and hurt a woman with a child, meaning she's pregnant, so that her fruit departs, meaning it has a miscarriage, it dies or is injured from her, and yet no mischief follow, he shall be surely punished for his actions, according as the woman's husband will lay upon him, meaning, what he decides to do with the courts. You hear that? And he shall or will pay as the judges have predetermined. And if any mischief follow, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. It says this eye for eye law was given to Israel relative to 1, a person who hurts a pregnant woman, resulting in her child's injury or even death. 2, the kind of punishment the judges must enact upon the very finding of the person that is guilty in a criminal trial proceedings. It says this law was to ensure that the judges were bound to execute equal punishment. That is, to not have any favoritism, and it would not work against the poor. And that the value of the child's life would certainly be protected. And the same law and its purpose is applied to other criminal acts as well. It says in each case, the eye for an eye law took place in a criminal trial, and the statutory equivalent of imposing sentence upon the guilty party. It says this requirement was a law of opportunity. Okay, it says it's relative to criminal sentencing. This is the same standard that is used today, and even God expressed in response to killing Cain, when Cain killed Abel, in the book of Genesis, when we read about that in the first couple of chapters. Who sheds man's blood, by man will his blood be shed. Okay, it says, for in the very image of God made he man, meaning man was made in his own image. It was a direction to the judges of the Jewish nation what punishment to inflict in case of mains for terror to such as would do to mischief, to those who do mischief on the one hand, and for a restraint to such as have mischief done to them on the other hand. Okay, that they may not insist on a greater punishment than is proper. It says this is not a life for an eye or a limb for a tooth, but observe proportion. It has to be equal, an eye for an eye sort of thing. Equal punishment for the crime that fits the crime. All right, this law was not a command that each person rendered evil for evil against his fellow citizens, so that people would go about, enforcing their own justice against all who harm them or other people. No. Says the Pharisees were undetermined this law's purpose and imposing their own agenda on the people instead of following what Jesus taught. Jesus publicly corrected their error and quickly received their resentment towards him, as in virtually every other instruction Jesus invoked. The Old Testament in his Sermon on the Mount says, where he explained its true meaning and broadened the concepts of love to ensure the Pharisees were not abusing the people, and the people knew the true sense of the law. This is a far cry from ridding Christians of preservation and protection. Now let's look at love thy enemy, or love your enemy, is what that means. And Jesus proclaimed another Old Testament teaching here in his sermon, and again corrected what the Pharisees were teaching the Jews. He said this. He says, "You have heard that it has been said, you shall love your neighbor and hate thy enemy," or your enemy. "But I," this is Jesus speaking, "say to you, love your enemies, bless, turn that curse, then that curse you, do good to them that hate you, or do bad towards you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and abuse you and persecute you and say false things about you," and etc., etc. The Old Testament taught man to love his enemy too. Okay, this love is towards all mankind and causes him to treat to treat his fellow man, or treat them fairly and equitably, meaning equally, using the Old Testament as a benchmark, his source of definition. Jesus did not command preservation, did not command passivism for Christians, walking an extra mile, giving one's coat, and such are inconveniences and were essential to the Old Testament law of love, but they are not close to having one's throat cut or arms severed and lying down to be trodden upon or under the very feet of men who are dictators or tyrants. The Old Testament did not teach that, or Jesus for the matter either. So that's something to notate here. Says what is notable here is how Jesus described love your neighbor or love your enemy, compared to how he and the apostles describe love your neighbor. In every instance where love your neighbor or thy neighbor in the King James is mentioned, it is always followed by as, meaning yourself or thyself in the King James. But where love your neighbor is mentioned, it is not qualified with as yourself. This is significant here because loving yourself is the most identifiable and fundamental form of love in the world. It relates to the two great earthly blessings of God at the very moment of creation. It says preservation is one and protection is the other. Self-love further serves as the universal method of identifying with other people. It says if one does not love himself, he cannot love or even relate to others. It says when one hates himself or herself, he or she is only a harm and also detriments, and also is a detriment to society. I mean, they shouldn't be in society because they cause harm. It says when they're like that. It says by using the qualifier as thyself or yourself when describing loving one's neighbor and not using it when describing loving one's enemy, there is a clear difference between the two categories of love. Loving one's neighbor involves preservation and protection. And of course, on the other hand, the second category is loving one's enemy involves doing good to them. It means praying for their blessings and not seeking their harm or revenge. All right, which is what the Old Testament required of Israel too, as well as us. As such, Jesus compared loving one's enemy to God's providing the sun and the rain to the just and the unjust alike. What is doing good to man generally is the very mark of a peaceful and just man or person. However, loving one's enemy is limited by, greater obligation towards one's neighbor. Okay, neighbors actually. God provides the sun and the rain for the unjust and the just alike, like we just noted. But God also punishes specific acts of evil and protects and avenges the innocent accordingly too. See, so that's something to think about. Okay. It says, applying this principle of love further. Let's take it one step further here. One cannot categorize Jesus' sacrifice as the same as man's sacrifice. It is erroneous to even say, since Jesus gave of himself voluntarily. It wasn't by force. He did it without any thought or recourse. He did it automatically. He did it for us so we could have a Savior. Okay? Without any resistance at all. He just died for us because he loves us so much. Christians must do the same too as well. That Jesus was God in the flesh with all divine attributes and authority as well. This sacrifice, I should say his sacrifice, conquered death and also hell and the grave, because he resurrected on the third day. It says his death protected life. This was Jesus' power, and only he possessed it. See, since man has no power, that is so divine, it's divine power, and since Jesus' sacrifice was once and for all, man's sacrifice is earthly and relates to the very power God put in man. All right, preserving and protecting. Okay, by definition, a Christian's laying down his or her life for his brethren must be for the very purpose of saving the very lives of others. Just as Jesus' death was intended to save man who believe and who obey him. It says in summary here, loving one's enemy does not mean to allow the enemy to kill you or your family. No more than loving your child requires you to let the child harm himself or even other people. All right. Now let's look at Jesus' response to specific cultural conditions during that time, as well. See how it relates to today as well, because it seems very similar and evident to us today too. It says, in addition to the analysis above, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount was a response to the specific cultural ills of his day, and also to our day. Jesus said in his sermon, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth." To begin this sermon, Jesus qualified his teaching to the people who were hearing certain things from their religious leaders and the Pharisees with their wishy-washy mixed up doctrines and laws and their superstitions and whatever. Giving how Jesus treated the Pharisees all throughout his earthly ministry. Jesus had a major problem with their application of Jewish interpretation of the law, okay, which he revealed more directly later on in his ministry. Jesus thus highlighted the difference between what the people were hearing from the Pharisees and what God actually really said and meant. All right, clearly, Jesus Christ our Lord intended to teach all the people that correctly interpreting scriptures is an important, and relying on what religious leaders say can only distort the real true meaning. In doing this, Jesus confirmed what the Old Testament taught and clarified its misapplication by what the Pharisees were trying to sell, what they were trying to teach, which is a bunch of foolishness. All right, now let's look at this. Violating the very purpose of the law, i.e. an eye for an eye. All right, tooth for a tooth. The Pharisees enacted their own, that's what they did, their own version of their own law of justice. They applied their own law and tradition, like I said, against the people they found deserving, okay, of punishment. Matthew Henry once commented about these Pharisees. It says, but some of the Jewish teachers who were not the most compassionate men in the world insisted upon it as necessary that such revenge should be taken even by private persons, says themselves, and that there was no room left for remission or the acceptance of satisfaction. It says even now, when they were all under the government force of the Roman, magistrates of that day, as well as what we see now happening in our government to a certain degree. If we don't do something about it, it will be more, but that's why we need to be aware of it. Consequently, the judicial law fell to the ground right there in their face, fell on their face. And of course, yet, they were still zealous for anything that looked harsh and severe. They were going to inflict their law anyway and go against God's law. All right, so when Jesus stated, "You have heard that it had been written," or said, he did not attack the Jewish law at all. Rather, Jesus was attacking what the Pharisees said, okay? All right, he was accusing all the Pharisees for their harsh treatment of others, the people in the society that was contrary to the Jewish law, because their law was different from the Jewish law. You see, some people think, there's this law, we got to follow it, and this law goes against what the Jews were saying, but that's not the case here. So anyway, let's move on. And so Jesus was trying to set them straight, in other words. Jesus put the public on notice here, that they were being treated wrongfully by their own leadership during that time. He was instructing the Pharisees not to ignore the greater matters, of judgment, which means justice. And Jesus warned the people, He went on to warn the people of this. Okay, here we go. It says like this on other occasions as well, saying, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees," which was the false teachings that they were teaching, of the Pharisees, and of the leaven of Herod, meaning the false teachings of Herod. Jesus' teachings did not create a new doctrine at all. No. It did not create a new doctrine that was contrary to the law. No, he confirmed the very importance of correctly following the moral laws of the Old Testament that God ordained and put in place. Instead, the Pharisees weren't doing that. So we're going to argument number 4. It says, do not render evil for evil. Okay. So self-defense rejectors also use the render not evil for evil verses to justify their position, but this has nothing to do with self-defense. Render not what is evil for evil teaches that people should not seek vengeance, against those who have done them, minor harm or inconvenienced them in some way, but should foster goodwill in society, all around the world. This goodwill is advanced by letting personal conveniences or trifles go. Don't hold those against people. Don't, keep a list. Let it go. Forgive them. And just let it go. That's what it's saying here. Life's too short, because it can make you bitter and make you mad if you hold all that stuff in. It says, and where remedy is needed, using the proper raft of the government to repair civil wrongs or disputes. It says this avoids the anarchy, where government undermines or destroys the very evidence or every evidence of protecting life. However, it steps outside of this teaching and requires a different response. This avoids tyranny, says the very element that remains in all cases of self-defense. Otherwise, anarchy or tyranny will result and prevail. It says to rid self-defense and to preserve evil is ridiculous, or is really ludicrous. Really is, folks. It says the following verses here. Here are the New Testament verses describing the render not evil for evil teaching. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 verse 15, 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 9, and finally Romans 12 verse 17. It says each which are addressed below. It says before getting into this discussion, let's look at some definitions of these words. Would be definitely that definitely are shown. The word render, which means apondinomai, to dibnomai, all right, and that's G59 or G591, means to pay back. And the word evil is chaos, which is G2556, means worthless or wicked. It says in all three verses it discusses this. Now let's go over here and examine this a little bit more closely, shall we? All right. It says below the same words are used here to instruct one of render not evil for evil, or what is evil, as will be shown self-defense. That's the root of what's in these verses. It cannot be evil and it mean paying back an evil, because you can't have self-defense with that kind of philosophy. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. All right, this is 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 verse 15. King James Version states, see that none render evil for evil unto any man, but every follower follow that which is good. All right, do among yourselves and to all people, says, or men. Says the application of this very instruction was to all people, not just Christians by themselves, none. It means all. It doesn't mean none. No, it means any man and woman, child. It says, and all, men. It says this universal application is similar to Paul's exhortation in Romans chapter 13. It says, let every soul be subject. It's not leaving out one, or only applies to certain people. It applies to everybody. Regarding to submission, the subject matter of that, to submission to government, All right. No, it says rendering not evil for evil. It says echoes the same exhortation and principle that Paul said, as well as what's said in the Old Testament, that man should pursue social peace and also avoid fulfilling the very lust of the flesh in the world to harm or do harm to others. All right, these are the very lessons, civics, as much as anything else, and are not doctrines of slave promotion. Okay, so you can't have slaves in self-defense. Because self-defense, when it's inactive and it's working in societies, there are no slaves. Okay, let's look at lawlessness, justice. All right, lawlessness, justice creates charos, all right, and perpetuates evil, actions one against another. Okay, it says, and causes souls to be spoiled at the very core of God's very instructions concerning all civil relationships, promoting good and punishing evildoers is essential here. Just as men would not surrender everything he owns to a slothful neighbor, as a man would not surrender all his rights to a tyrannous government with a dictator, the balance of evil life must be sought by Christians alike. Even if you're not Christian, this is just basic understanding of how a free society works. But if you are a Christian especially, because that's what we're talking about, which requires one to better understand how to avoid the two extremes of anarchy and of tyranny. It says at the very center of this is self-defense. That's what's in this very discussion. Okay, we're almost done. All right. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 10 shows us, in the King James, it says, anarchy is avoided by having just laws to govern man's civil relationships. It also states, when thou does lend thy brother or your brother anything, that you shall not or you will not go into his house to fetch his pledge. Okay? Now what does that mean? That means you don't take it on your own to go get it. Okay? You rely on you rely on the Lord, and you rely on the laws of the land to handle your dispute. Okay? Self-help, that's what this is. That's what I'm talking about. It says remedies undermines harmonious and society and lawful governments. Okay, Romans chapter 12, verse 19 in the King James also explains this for us. The same principle also is found here, and it also shows what man should do instead of exercising self-help, meaning taking it on yourself. Okay, so avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath, meaning don't do wrath to other people who have done wrong to you. It says wrath man should seek prefers the wrath of government. It's described in Romans chapter 13 verse 4 over self-help, meaning you don't take it on yourself to do it, because government provides a mutual ground or method and common authority for resolving civil disputes. All right, simply put and stated, says remedying evil for evil is where a person tries, all right, to reinforce, or not to reinforce, but to enforce his own, all right, civil remedies. Okay, and remember I said you don't do that. You let the authorities do it. It says in society, it says when government is available to resolve the civil dispute matter, naturally, okay, and fairly. That's what's supposed to be in a good government now. It says this, however, assumes that government and law actually protect the very rights of the people or person, not as a fault, meaning finding fault in them, but also to really protect the true and innocent. It says when that no longer happens, what we have here is different problems that will often arise and must be remedied or resolved, overlooked. Okay, now let's look at this. The underlying Paul's lesson here in civics is this. It says, where government and law destroy the rights of the people, self-help may be used to save the greater man. Okay, that means you have to take laws in your own hand if everything gets out of hand. There's no law and order with your government in your area. But you need to use the government as long as there is law and order and moral laws and justification. But you don't take it on yourself while there's that in the area, but that all breaks down. Then you need to take laws into your hands at a severe point where there's no law. You would have to do law yourself. All right. It says at the expense of the lesser government. Okay, law. Okay. It says the point when self-help is used is a matter of conscience and social response. Okay, there is no exact formula here for every society, but the American Declaration of Independence expressed this very philosophy of that way. Okay, it says mankind are more disposed to suffer. It says while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are. I want to read this. There's a little bit of the top.